Hello everyone, welcome to this talk entitled Rewilding Archaeology. My name is Dr. Ed Treasure. I'm an archaeologist working for Wessex Archaeology in the Salisbury office. My main area of expertise is in the identification of plant remains, although more broadly, and the reason why I'm giving this talk today, is that I'm interested in the use of archaeological datasets to provide information on processes of rewilding. So to begin with, what do we mean when we say rewilding? Rewilding is a form of ecosystem management that has arisen out of our need to conserve biodiversity and work towards a more sustainable future. Broadly defined, it refers to the repair or restoration of ecosystem services through the introduction, or rather reintroduction, of selected species, effectively allowing nature to take its course. There are many examples of rewilding projects across the world, although to take the example of Rewilding Britain here in the UK, it is defined as the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. Rewilding seeks to reinstate natural processes and, where appropriate, missing species, allowing them to shape the landscape and the habitats within. Now, one of the key words to take away from this definition is the word natural. What do we mean by this? And as I hope to show throughout this talk, defining what a natural habitat actually is can be quite a challenging concept. Now, there's much to be admired in the rewilding movement, since I hope it comes as no surprise that the world faces a biodiversity crisis due to habitat fragmentation and species extinction, all of which is happening against a backdrop of climate change. For example, in the UK, it's estimated around 13% of the UK is covered in woodland, although about half of this is made up of natural forestry plantations. This is significantly lower than that seen in our European counterparts. And in the UK, we've also killed off many important species such as bear, wolves, lynx, and beaver. Now, any steps that we can take to mitigate the present-day biodiversity crisis is welcomed. However, rewilding as a movement is not without controversy. How do we define appropriate restoration baselines? What species should we conserve? What timescales are we working with? And how big should our projects be? How do we establish appropriate management strategies? And how effective can rewilding ultimately be in a landscape shaped by millennia of human activity? I will say from the outset that this talk is by no means an attack on the rewilding movement. There's much to be admired in its principles, but rather what I hope to show is that using archaeological datasets, we can perhaps refine our understanding of what we want to rewild and ultimately inform conservation management. In particular, archaeologists and researchers in related areas can provide a unique long-term perspective on changes in the environment and crucially provide information on factors which have shaped present-day biodiversity patterns. We can place conservation management practices within a wider historical and ecological framework by understanding factors such as past vegetation structure and human impacts on past environments. For example, in the UK, some of the most detailed records for the changing composition of woodlands only extend back 100 years. However, using archaeological and paleoecological datasets, we can extend this timeline back 2 millennia, to the beginning of the Holocene and the end of the last glacial maximum, that is over 12,000 years ago. So how do we do this? So there are many different tools available at our disposal. Pollen grains trapped within lake sediments or peat bogs and floodplains can provide information on the composition of past woodlands and environments. We can complement this with plant macroremains. Those are plants that are just visible to the naked eye. These tell us about plants growing within a particular environment. We can also use these plant remains to pinpoint the introduction of agriculture, identifying cultivated crops such as cereals, and when certain species such as spelt wheat or bread wheat were introduced, together with a whole range of non-native weed species. And these quickly colonise arable fields and other habitats. We can also look at charcoal to understand which woodland species were directly exploited by people in the past. Where preserved, wood remains can provide information on the composition of past forests, particularly where we find submerged forests. As some of you may have seen following winter storms, these get exposed around the coast. We can take this a step further. We can look at ring curvature and growth rings within these timber fragments to understand how they grew, what sort of environments they're growing in. Faunal remains recovered from archaeological sites tell us about when certain species such as the wolves and lynx became extinct, and whether other species such as rabbits and some deer species were first introduced. There are also other lines of evidence, such as insects. Insects are fantastic indicators of past habitats, since they often have very restricted ecological niches that they inhabit. Similarly, mollusks, such as snails, being relatively slow-moving, provide significant information on the nature of past environments. All these different sources of information can be tied together within chronological frameworks using radiocarbon dating and other dating methods. And these are just some of the environmental records that we can use to understand the past environment. Now moving on, so I want to provide an example of how we can actually use these data sets. And in particular, I'm going to focus on two case studies. So that's the Primeval Wildwood and then the New Forest National Park. Now the Primeval forests, or as they're otherwise termed, the Wildwood, existed across Central and Northern Europe between approximately 12,000 to 5,000 years ago. This is a period largely before the widespread adoption of farming, although it also encompasses the first farming communities in Europe. These forests are said to have been in their most natural state, and they are consequently used as targets or benchmarks for conservation in movements such as rewilding. Whilst it's recognised that rewilding movements could never truly recreate such primeval forests, one of the major debates is over how we should manage or recreate such woodlands. In particular, the level of openness within these environments is a topic of significant debate. So if you were to imagine flying over Central and Western Europe approximately 10,000 years ago, would you see a dense closed canopy woodland, or rather would you see a more open mosaic-like landscape with large tracts of grassland, herbaceous vegetation interspersed between more heavily wooded areas? This is a question of central importance. It governs how we should approach the management of areas through processes such as rewilding. To some extent, it has already had a direct influence on conservation policy. In areas such as the UK, Netherlands and Poland, this has really already been put into practice. For a long time, the established wisdom was that prior to the arrival of agriculture, woodlands were closed canopy, akin to those seen in a Tolkien novel. It's thought that a more open wooded landscape only emerged with the onset of farming. However, several researchers, including a prominent Dutch ecologist called Frans Vera, argued that this could not have been the case, due to the abundance of oak and hazel within these woodlands. Both these species are light demanding, so how were they so abundant in woodlands? Well, it was argued that large grazing herbivores such as elk, deer and aurochs, as well as the omnivorous wild boar, played an essential role in the creation and maintenance of these habitats. In particular, it was argued to be a cyclical turnover in vegetation. There was first a relatively open park-like landscape with a few trees, followed by a scrub component. This scrub component protected the trees and then forest grew up. As the forest matured, herbivores re-entered the forest, preventing further scrub regeneration. These trees then reached maturity and died, and so the whole process began again. This is a particularly important idea since it directly influences conservation policy on how woodlands should be managed, with notable relevance to the role of grazing animals within these habitats. Through later archaeological and paleoecological research, we have come to accept many of these ideas regarding the openness of the primeval wood. For example, pollen studies, plant remains and insects now indicate that some areas of the landscape within the UK were in fact relatively open, although there was considerable regional and local variability in this. However, questions were raised quite quickly over the role that large herbivores should play. Modern research has shown that some herbivores, such as deer and grazing cattle within nature reserves, do maintain open habitats. Similarly, beavers, being the little ecological engineers that they are, can have profound effects on woodlands, creating really quite large open patches, particularly within river valleys. Aside from humans, beavers probably had the most profound impact on these early woodlands than any other species. Now, there are some other issues there if we examine this in more detail. So the UK has been an island for approximately 7,500 years. Its forests contained a more restricted range of large herbivores than its counterparts on the European continent. The faunal record for this period would certainly not suggest that species such as elk or aurochs were especially abundant. Similarly, insect remains such as dung beetles, whilst they do indicate the presence of large herbivores, they're not present in the quantities we would expect if herbivores were abundant. That said, we do need more insect data from earlier deposits, and this is where archaeological data can be invaluable. However, there are further issues regarding the role of large herbivores. If we look at Ireland, so in Ireland, in the early Holocene, so that's approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, large herbivores were largely absent, and the same goes for the wild boar, although these were potentially introduced later on in this period. Now, considering the absence of these large herbivores in Ireland compared to the UK, we should expect woodland composition to differ significantly between the two areas. However, this is not the case, and in fact woodlands in the UK and Ireland at this date seem relatively similar. So when we take this evidence together, we're seeing a disjunct between some of the evidence, raising questions over the importance of large grazing herbivores in these primeval forests, with significant implications for the role they should play in modern conservation management. This is particularly pertinent considering that we've already killed off many of our native large herbivores in the UK, and we therefore have to rely on reintroducing wild species or using traditional domesticated breeds of cattle. Now, there's one particularly important species which is lacking from these debates so far, and that's predators. Predators such as wolves and lynx can play a really important role in these habitats. This is well indicated by Yellowstone National Park in North America, where wolves were reintroduced and created so-called landscapes of fear. In more simple words, they discouraged large herbivores from grazing in some habitats, because if they did, they would have been eaten. This in turn disrupted normal ecological processes, allowing some vegetation to regenerate. Consequently, the reintroduction of predator species such as lynx or wolves would likely play an important role in any discussions of rewilding, with wolves seen as ecological cornerstone species, which would play a vital role in ecosystem functioning. There's also another important component lacking from these debates, and that's us, humans. So the impact of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations on the environment is widely debated. The old traditional view was that hunter-gatherers had minor impacts on their environments. However, this view is no longer supported by the archaeological evidence, and as well as ethnographic evidence. In particular, we now know that hunter-gatherers played a very active role in modifying environments to promote the growth of certain plant and wood species and to increase food productivity to facilitate hunting. For example, by clearing and maintaining openings within forests and other environments, light-demanding species such as hazel and wild fruits such as crabapple, pear and raspberry would be encouraged to grow. Through plant remains recovered from archaeological sites, we know that these were major plant food resources exploited amongst a diverse range of other species, and sometimes these resources were exploited on an intensive scale. Through the analysis of charcoal, we know that hunter-gatherers directly influence woodland ecology. For example, taxa within the rose family, such as hawthorn and blackthorn, as well as other shrubby species, are well represented in these records. All of these are light demanding, indicating that humans were colonising open areas within woodlands. We also find evidence to indicate that hunter-gatherers were actively burning landscapes. We see this in particular through pollen records. In particular, many archaeologists and paleoecologists now emphasise the importance of fire and influence ecosystem dynamics in these early woodlands. While some fires could certainly have been started by lightning strikes, it seems highly probable that humans were actively burning areas of the landscape, effectively in a form of management. There's a particularly interesting side point here. If we consider that hunter-gatherers played an active role in the deliberate management of the environment, does this blur the boundary between what we would call a farmer and what we would call a hunter-gatherer? Either way, the point stands that it's very hard to talk of a truly natural wildwood in the early Holocene, with hunter-gatherers roaming about the place. And finally, we need to consider the impact that agriculture had on these wooded environments. In the UK, the first evidence we see for the introduction of domesticated animals such as cattle and sheep, as well as cereals such as emmer wheat and barley, is around 6,000 years ago. We know from the archaeological and paleoecological record that the arrival of agriculture had a profound impact on woodlands and the environment. By the Bronze Age, woodlands were being cleared on an increasingly intensive scale, and this continued throughout the later prehistoric period, the Roman period, and into the medieval period. In fact, these past land use practices have irreversibly shaped the physical and chemical properties of the soils to such an extent that we will never truly be able to recreate these past wild woods. Now, this is a point that is very much acknowledged by ecologists such as Franz Vera and the Rewilding movement. So, if we were to take all this together, where does it leave us? Can we use early Holocene records as analogues for creating new woodlands? How should we manage these woodlands? Are humans to play an important role in them? These are complicated questions, probably best addressed by an ecologist and those working directly in conservation. However, what it does serve to underline is some of the complexities surrounding ideas of rewilding past environments. It also emphasises the role that archaeological datasets can have in informing conservation practices, as well as understanding the factors that have shaped present-day biodiversity patterns. A little earlier, I raised the question of whether we can truly talk of natural landscapes. How do we even define what a natural landscape is? The New Forest is an excellent example of this. For those that don't know, the New Forest is a national park in the south of England. The landscape is composed of species such as grassland, heaths, mires and woodlands, with European beech being particularly important. It's been suggested that the New Forest landscape is one of the closest parallels we could get to the primeval wood, since it is a landscape in which grazing animals such as ponies, cattle and deer, and wild boar play a central role in the management of the area. However, how natural is this landscape really? Well, looks can be quite deceiving to those who don't know. Whilst areas of the New Forest may give the impression of a pretty rugged and wild landscape, in reality the situation is quite different. Centuries, if not millennia, of management have led to the artificial creation of many aspects of this landscape. Some of the most profound changes occurred with William the Conqueror making it a hunting park in the 11th century. For example, the extensive areas of heathland are to a large extent linked to human activity. By heathland, I'm referring to plants which have a preference for acidic soils, the most enigmatic being heather, from which we take the name heathland. Heathlands are well recognised to be biodiversity hotspots, supporting important species such as birds, insects and reptiles. However, heathlands are also a sort of in-between natural landscape, one that has been heavily crafted by human intervention, and one also created by our wet climate. Many heathlands developed during the Bronze Age, although there were also significant periods of heathland expansion during the medieval period. Now, these environments were often really valued economic resources, particularly for fuel, fodder, and as roofing material. They were also often grazed and used for arable cultivation. Thus, the creation of heathlands is closely entwined with human history. Similarly, if we look at the woodlands of the New Forest, we can see that centuries of management have led to the artificial dominance of beech. This same pattern is replicated in other forests, such as those in the Chilterns or Epping Forest in North London. The predominance of beech within these woodlands is partly because this species provides an excellent source of timber, as well as being highly valued for producing charcoal, which could in turn be used to manufacture iron. The practice of managing these woodlands often led to the clearance of other species and the pollarding of beech, so that's chopping off the tree halfway up to encourage fast new growth. In essence, this is a form of early sustainable management, which works with the natural properties of beech to shed its branches. A further factor at play here was the selective removal of other important woodland species, such as oak, for use in the Navy. Within the last century, the practice of pollarding beech trees has fallen out of action, and consequently, one of our most cherished habitats is at risk, with ongoing issues over how we manage these woodlands going forward. Should we reintroduce pollarding as a form of natural management, working on the principle that human-made, that is to say, anthropogenic habitats are equally valid conservation targets? We know from both paleoecological and archaeological records that these beech-dominated woodlands are a relatively recent occurrence, with other species such as oak, hazel and birch, together with some lime, being far more widespread prior to the medieval period. Now, there's also questions here over the role that grazing animals should play in the New Forest going forward. Are the densities of animals within the environment too high? Taking this all together, I hope that this talk has illustrated how we can use paleoecological and archaeological records to inform upon debates surrounding rewilding. In particular, the evidence gathered through these datasets can play an important role in informing how we approach conservation management going forward, with questions raised regarding the role of humans, fire, predators, grazing herbivores and other animals such as beavers in conservation policy. By using the deep time perspective provided by archaeological datasets, we can understand how the composition and structure of past environments has changed, either in response to human impact or due to climatic changes in the past, or maybe even both. To some extent, archaeology provides a template. What we are left with is the idea that landscapes should perhaps instead be viewed as cultural landscapes, since we need to recognise that past land use practices have profoundly and often irreversibly shaped present-day biodiversity patterns. It is now recognised that these so-called cultural landscapes, often being important for biodiversity hotspots in their own right, are equally valid conservation targets. The better we can understand the factors that led to the creation of these present-day cultural landscapes, the better we can make informed decisions to work towards a more sustainable future, And I would say that's where archaeology has a key role to play going forward.